Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Soh Jaipil Lecture Series. I am so delighted to moderate today's talk because we have Professor Namlin Ha with us, who will be talking about Imjin War, or the Hideyoshi invasion of Korea from 1592 to 98. I'm even more excited to see that we received about 180 RSVPs for this event. Since most of our events are focused on modern or contemporary issues, I really appreciate it when we have lectures on pre-20th century Korea. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Namlin Ha. He's a professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. His teaching focuses on pre-modern Japanese history and international relations in pre-modern East Asia. His major publications include Prayer and Play in Late Tokugawa Japan, Asakusa Sensoji and Edo Society, published by Harvard University Asia Center in 2000, and Death and Social Order in Tokugawa Japan, Buddhism, Anti-Christianity, and the Danka System, published again by Harvard University Asia Center in 2007. He has also published many journal articles and book chapters. I won't be able to list them all here, but I would like to share two recent book chapters that are relevant to today's talk. The Celestial Warriors, Ming Military Aid and Abuse During the Korean War, 1592 to 98, in the edited book, the East Asian War, 1592 to 1598, International Relations, Violence, and Memory, published by Routledge in 2015, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi's Invasion of the Chosŏn Kingdom, 1592 to 98, in Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Asian History, published by Oxford University Press, 2019. He is currently writing a book on Japan's invasion of Chosŏn Korea in 1592 to 98 and Ming China's involvement. Professor Hall will present about 45 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So we'll accept questions using our Q&A box. So please feel free to ask your questions during or after his talk. All right, now I'll turn it over to Professor Ha. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jisoo Kim, for your invitation and the kind introduction. I also thank all participants via Zoom today. I will try not to waste your valuable time and would also like to learn from you. So let me pull out my PPT file, which would make things a bit easy. Let me do this one here. Okay, so I have been working on the Imjin War for some time, and I'm glad to share some of my thoughts with you today. As a whole, I interpret the ways in which the Imjin War unfolded from the beginning to the end in terms of three key factors: the military, diplomacy, and governance. Roughly speaking, these three key factors interacted like this in each country and among the three countries, all contributing to shaping the contours of the war in this process. In the pre-war time, all relations were bilateral during the war, trilateral after the war, bilateral. So in this process, the war unfolded in the Korean Peninsula. I am using a number of graphics and diagrams and maps in order to offset the deficits of faceless conversation. Within this overall framework of analysis, I would like to discuss the issue of the Chosŏn Dynasty survival. What I mean by dynastic survival, simply speaking, in this case, it refers to the fact that the Chosŏn Dynasty weathered the war of invasion and continued to exist. So how was it possible? The answer is simple, because Japan failed to achieve its war goals and eventually withdraw all troops from the Korean Peninsula, all right? So focusing on the fact that Japan failed to achieve its war goals, more precisely, Hideyoshi's war goals, what I argue today is this. So Hideyoshi's failure in achieving his original war goals had to do with, among a few major factors, Joseon's military operations of defense in 1592. The operations that capitalized on the military economies of a small scale, which was built into the governance of its military system. So does my suggestion make sense? Probably not to many people, simply because Joseon's military was infamously feeble and notoriously corrupt. In any case, the end result of Japan's failure was its troop withdrawal. Speaking of troop withdrawal in the war, theoretically, we can think of three possible reasons for the military reasons, for non-military reasons, or a mix of these two. So long story short, this diagram shows the overall trajectory of Hideyoshi's war goals. Why Hideyoshi? Hideyoshi was the person who had the power to make a decision regarding troop withdrawal, even though he had died before it happened. In this diagram, you see a number of turning points here a number of turning points that forced Hideyoshi to readjust or reset his war goals over time. And eventually Japan's withdrawal, as you see. So this is somewhat different from many other scholars in understanding the overall progress of the war. So Hideyoshi's initial goal was to subjugate Korea, and then it shattered. And then from this time on, he tried to end the war with a rhetoric of a victory. And then he didn't get what he needed eventually. Given this, you may want to ask what made each turning point happen. As I have implied, each of the turning points was produced through the interplay of military, diplomacy, and governance among the three agents of the war, namely Joseon, Japan, and Ming China. So from a different angle, the modus operandi of the whole progress of the war can be divided into these two, the military and the diplomacy, and further into 6 sub-topics like this. So what I am focusing on today is this one, Korean military. Joseon's military and its role in the survival of its dynasty. Even so, as you see in this diagram, I will further zoom in on the year of 1592, which includes A. So here's why. So A, B, C, D, and then here are many turning points pertaining to diplomacy. So why A? Basically, the B and C pertain to Chinese military operations, whether successful or unsuccessful. In D, in addition to the Chinese military, the Korean military, particularly Isunshin's navy also played an important role. But in D, the Chinese military made a backdoor deal with the Japanese. And as a result, the Japanese left Korea safely. The turning point D is a separate topic. In the overall progress of the war, the turning point A, this one was decisive. in crushing Hideyoshi's original war goals like this. This was his original goal, and then that's gone. That's gone, and he's in confusion, and he tried to end the war. More importantly, it was made by Joseon's own defense without Ming China's involvement. On the third day of the fifth month, this numbers indicate this one. The first one is a month, and then the day. The fifth month, third day, the capital, Hansong of Joseon, fell to the Japanese. It was merely 20 days after their landing in Busan. Two Japanese understanding, as was taken for granted in Sengoku, Japan, taking the enemy's headquarters amounted to the taking of the entire territory of the enemy. So in this case, the loser was supposed to open up the gate of his castle, and kneel down on the ground, and greet the victor. So it was a custom known as kaijo, this one. However, when the Japanese took Seoul, the Joseon king was found missing. And that's uncanny and unfathomable as far as the Japanese were concerned. About 2 weeks later, the 16th, Hideyoshi in Nagoya received the first report that his troops had taken the capital of Joseon. Upon the report, Hideyoshi ordered, like this one, when the Korean king is captured, to not kill him. The point is, I will provide him with ganninbun, this one, ganninbun, kudasarabeku soro. This is the key point. The term, the ganninbun, can be translated into a land for living expenses. What the Hideyoshi meant by ganninbun is that Hideyoshi would grant some land in the Osaka or Kyoto area to King Sånjo in return for King Sånjo's service as a subject to Hideyoshi, as all daimyo did in Japan. So in other words, as he had already repeatedly stated, Hideyoshi's goal of the military campaign was to take Hansong and thereby to bring the Korean king to Japan and make him serve Hideyoshi as a subject. So this is his order of attack. In his order of attack on Joseon, on the 13th day of the third month, Hideyoshi used the term shushi. Here, this one is gorai shushi no gi, gorai shushi. They referred Joseon as gorai. Hideyoshi used the term shushi as the goal of his military operation against Joseon. So the term shushi means offering service to the superior. So making Sånjo serve Hideyoshi, providing shushi to Hideyoshi. However, the daimyo generals who gathered in Seoul realized that the country was not really subjugated. This is what Hideyoshi understood. Taking Seoul means taking the entire country, but the daimyo who took Seoul realized that that was not the case. You have to move further to provinces and to counties to fully subjugate the country. So in order to subjugate the whole country, a few days later, the daimyo generals began to spread out to the assigned provinces. Hideyoshi in Nagoya had no ideas of what was going on in Korea. It's true, Joseon was not subjugated yet. already from early in the 5th month, the Koreans began to strike back, starting with Lee Sun-shi's navy in the south. He was the admiral of the left division of Jeolla province from Okpo, Hapo, Jeokjinpo, and then back to his base in Yeosu, Usuyong. On the ground as well, there were some movements of defense. The rise of self-defense fighters, commonly called righteous army, or 의병, at the time in Joseon. The term 의병 has an uneven or zigzagged history in East Asia. So when Kwak Je-woo organized a force of self-defense fighters, local officials tried to arrest him because nobody was allowed to take arms without the king's approval. However, the government had no option but to embrace any form of resistance against the Japanese. The Kim Song-il, whom King Sånjo was charged to raise fighters and placate people, encouraged runaway soldiers or deserters, in Korean 산졸, to join the ranks of self-defense, allocated public grain and weapons, and ordered local magistrates to work with self-defense leaders. So all this worked well from the beginning, thanks to the governing system at work, if troubled in some hard-hit areas. So the fightings are all based on materials like this one on the Korean side, many diaries and so on, and information from these sources should be cross-checked against the Japanese materials. So it's a long process of gleaning data. 2 days after he had received a report on the taking of Seoul, Hideyoshi, 18th day in the 5th month, Hideyoshi issued a long memorandum of 25 articles of instructions to Hidetsugu Kanpaku. The most striking items were Hidetsugu will be assigned as the Kanpaku of the Great Tang, referring to Ming China. The emperor will be relocated to the capital of Great Tang. And then regarding Korea, Joseon is still called Gorai, Goryeo, would be assigned to this guy or this guy. So Okareru Beku Soro. So assigning to somebody as Kyushu in Japan is assigned to somebody else. So that he's treating Joseon and Kyushu in the same way, meaning that both places are under my control, completely subjugated. And then 2 weeks later, this is the 6th month, 3rd day, Hideyoshi further laid out a more detailed plan by issuing a set of 2 orders. This one is one of them, and charged his 7 top officials, including Ishida Mitsunari, Mashita Nagamura, and so on, to deliver these 2 orders to the daimyo in Korea in person, because these 2 orders were considered so important. So one order was on how to govern Chosŏn Korea, and the other was on how to advance troops to the Ming in order to subjugate it. So regarding how to govern Joseon, Hideyoshi specified that a group of 2 or 3 officers would be installed as intendants. This term is the key, intendants, in each of Korea's 8 provinces. Here the term, the daikwan, this daikwan is the key, which means deputies. And then a couple of deputies in each province of Chosŏn. So it's a done deal. It's so easy. By sending just a couple of deputies to each province of Korea, governance will be done. The control will be achieved. And then regarding how to take Ming China, on the same day, he issued an order like this. So basically, it says all troops advance, all troops meaning without leaving anybody in Chosŏn Korea, all troops advance toward Ming by turns and speedily subjugate it. So this was the only, I should stress, the only military order Hideyoshi ever made in relation to Ming China. And I should also emphasize, Hideyoshi issued this order only after, not before, only after he had learned that the capital of Joseon was taken. When Hideyoshi was dreaming, Imjin's navy launched the second round of attacks on Japanese naval forces from Sacheon and Dangpo and Dangpo, Yulpo, and back to his base. And then not only a navy, but the self-defense, the fighters from in the 6th month, 정암진, and then 무게, and then 개포 or 계산포, and 초계, and uchi. And the Japanese goal was to penetrate into Jeolla province and take the provincial capital, Jeonju. But these locations were really excellent, blocking. There were several routes leading to Jeonju. One was from here to Jinju, and then Namon to Jeonju, or to Hamyang, or from here, Songju and Jire, and Uchi, Ucheokhyun, and Gochang, Hamyang, and then it's a mountain pass, Pallangchi to Namon, and then Jeonju. But all these key, the bottlenecks were blocked. The hit and run ambush attacks proved to be effective when Korea's self-defense fighters targeted a small group of Japanese troops at optimal locations. Ambush attacks on small group of Japanese at bottleneck locations. So it was a combination of wise tactics, governance, and geographical knowledge. They showed how the military economies of scale worked. They're seeing a seed of hope. The Joseon government grew more and more supportive of the self-defense fighters, forgiving and encouraging these people, Sãnjo, deserted soldiers, to join the ranks of self-defense, anointing self-defense leaders with official titles and offering public grain and weapons. As I have said, in ordinary times, nobody was allowed to organize an armed force without the king's approval. Taking arms without the king's order amounted to a treason. But King Sånjo's court in Uiju, in a remote corner of the country, was forced to offer ad hoc tolerance to locally organized armed forces, but at the same time try to bring them under control. So as a result, over time, the self-defense fighters were gradually transformed into a sort of semi-government troops. So in contrast, the Japanese troops are further spread out thin without a backup of their own food supplies. So they had to continue to plunder the Korean villages and committed atrocity. The Japanese were turned into mobs of plunderers, and thus invited more and more resistance from Koreans whose survival hinged on the same pool of food sources, So it was a war over food sources. Eventually, upon the news on a series of defeats by the Korean Navy, Hideyoshi ordered some naval daimyo, including Wakizaka Yasunaru, Yasuharu, Kuki, Yoshitaka, and so on, to rush to the south and strike the enemy who were spoiling his military operation from behind. So he was really upset. On the 8th day of the 7th month, the fleet of Wakizaka Yasuharu showed up near Gyeonnaeryang, around this area. Lee Sun-shin decided to lure them out to an open sea past the narrow strait near Hansong Island. It worked. The battle, commonly known as the Battle of Hansando, dealt a crushing defeat to the Japanese. The 59 Japanese warships were destroyed, and their commander, Wakizaka, barely escaped for life. Todo Takatora speedily reported the defeat of the Wakizaka fleet to Hideyoshi in Nagoya. Hideyoshi's reaction was swift. On the 15th day, he ordered the Japanese troops to stay away from naval battle. So more importantly, on the same day, Hideyoshi issued an order that rescinded, canceled his previous order, this one, how to advance troops to the Ming. Hideyoshi's new order reads, Korea should be fully pacified more than anything else. And I will cross the sea to Korea in the following spring and command the matter of conquering the Great Ming by myself. But what he realized was that Korea was not fully subjugated yet. From this time on, he called Korean defense Ikki, and that Ikki meaning domestic rebellions, on the premise that Korea is already under my control. Interestingly, however, Hideyoshi's top officials, Ishida and so on, who were carrying Hideyoshi's disorder, arrived in Hansong after Hideyoshi canceled his orders. Right? So it means that Hideyoshi's dream, more correctly, daydream, had been kept in the pockets of Ishida Mitsunari for about 1.5 months, but found dead there before getting out of the pockets. Along with all this, Hideyoshi's so-called grand design, which he had announced in the 5th month, was also dead silently, meaning relocating Kanpaku to Beijing and relocating the emperor to Beijing and so on. That kind of daydream, which people often call his grand design, grand strategy. The so-called grand strategy was none other than a delusion that existed in his mind only for about 2 months. His delusion never touched the ground. And by the way, this the grand design was not his original goals. So the war of Japan's invasion of Korea was now transformed dramatically. Yet there was still no single battle involving Chinese troops. A first battle conducted by Ming troops happened on the 17th day. Zhu Chengxun commanded about 3,000 troops, launched an attack on the Japanese in Pyongyang. It was the first military confrontation between Chinese and Japanese, and the only one in 1592. However, the battle did not last long. They crushed decisively. Zhu Chengxun collected the remaining troops and returned back to Liaodong. And the King Sånjo and his officials, of course, are disappointed. But more importantly, they awakened the we can use Chinese troops to fight against the Japanese invaders and save our country. So up to that point, a majority of Korean officials were negative to the idea of asking Ming China to send rescue troops. They did not much trust Chinese troops. So from this time on, the Joseon government began to pour its whole energy to convincing the Ming court, the Ming emperor, that Japan's real target was China, not Korea. And that therefore, the best strategy for China's security, not Korea's security, for China's security would be sending a massive military force and to defeat the Japanese in Korea before getting too late. So Joseon's diplomacy proved to be a great success. So another key issue in the study of the Imjin War. So in any case, Ming troops did not come back to Korea until the end of the year, the most critical year. It means that the Koreans fought alone against the Japanese to the end of the year of 1592. So more fightings. In the 7th month, all these critical areas were blocked, even attacked Yeongcheon, and then Cheongju, and then the Japanese tried to penetrate into Jeolla from the north, but blocked them Ungchi and then Ichi. So let me put all these battles in perspective in terms of what I mean by military economies of scale. So up to Seoul, the Japanese moved in large groups. And this is Korean forces, small, very small, the weak, couldn't confront these massive troops. Up to provinces, they were scattering, but still big groups. And the Koreans were like this. And then when they began to penetrate, spreading wide and thin, forming small groups like this, then Koreans found opportunities to selectively choose targets and strike them like this. So this happened in Gyeongsang and then southern Chungcheong and other places as well. So in the 8th month, Ishida Mitsunari and his fellow Bugyo and the daimyo held a meeting in Hansong. After the meeting, they reported Hideyoshi on 2 matters. First, it's getting harder and harder to secure provisions. And the second, Chinese troops had already come to Korea and launched an attack on Pyongyang with a joint force of more than 30,000 troops. A shortage of food was real, but the enemy force figure of 30,000 was a lie. But it didn't matter much. However, by this time, Hideyoshi had already left Nagoya for Osaka upon the news that his mother was ill. In the 8th month, this area was secured, and then Joseon fighters even tried to take Gyeongju back, and Gumsan, and then Yeonan as well. So as a whole, the wide and thin spread of Japanese troops who lacked central coordination and a spirit of unity proved to be vulnerable to Korean attacks. The Japanese were gradually confined to their bases or camps, loosely connected along the vulnerable corridors of communication. More critically, the Japanese troops had neither access to nor a backup of the local networks of governance. They were like scattered islands, isolated from each other. In contrast, according to one study, a bit less than 30% of the 67 local magistrates in Gyeongsang deserted their posts in the early stage of the war. But as situations improved, most of them returned back to their posts and were engaged in helping defense. Their role featured too, mobilizing deserted soldiers to the self-defense force or regular army and collecting military provisions. In particular, local clerks who maintained their own networks in the province were indispensable for the operation of defense. And then early in the 10th month, a Japanese force of about 13,000 attacked Jinju for several days. 13,000, and Jinju, there were about 3,800 forces under the command of Kim Shi-min. The Koreans fended the Japanese off. Again, the Jeolla province was protected. And the same thing in Hamgyong as well. On the 10th day of the 11th month, Hideyoshi got the report on the dire situations of Japanese troops in Korea. He issued almost identical orders to the daimyo in Korea, directing them to stay away from Korean rebellions. He called the Nikki, the domestic rebellions. Stay away from domestic rebellions until I cross the sea and suppress them all in the coming year. Hideyoshi and the daimyo generals were really frustrated that Koreans were staging domestic rebellions. Only in the 12th month, the final month of the year, Hideyoshi received a report that Nakagawa Hidemasa, a daimyo, had lost his life in an ambush attack, but it happened 2 months prior. It took about 2 months for a report like that to be delivered to Hideyoshi. So the daimyo generals in Korea began to manipulate their reports to Hideyoshi. On the 6th month of the 12th month, 6th day of the 12th month, Hideyoshi again ordered the daimyo generals in Korea to stay away from Korean rebels, repeating the same mantra, which nobody seemed to believe, that he would solve all troubles by himself at once in the coming year. But what he did not know was that the fight between his troops and the Koreans had already almost ceased as the Japanese holed up in their fortifications for the winter. So Hideyoshi's commandership ceased to work, and accordingly, his original war goals were lost, more precisely shattered in the latter half of 1592. So again, it should be reminded that this dramatic turn of the event had nothing to do with the Ming or Chinese troops. There was no single Chinese troop engaged in fighting against the Japanese after the mid-7th month to the end of the year. The Ming troops' attack on the Guanxi troops in Pyongyang in the first month of 1593 eventually pushed the Japanese troops to retreat to Hansong and then further to Busan. So from that time on, Hideyoshi really agonized all the way until his death over how to end the war, how to fix the mistake he had made. So it was a long process for the survival of his regime, not the survival of Chosŏn Dynasty. A process that unfolded in a game of diplomacy in most of the time. So Hideyoshi had to get away. He had to get away with a rhetoric of a victory from the war he had caused in the first place, but he failed to get what he needed. In contrast, Chosŏn Korea's survival was almost a done deal, at least by the first half of 1593. And the only problem that remained was when Japan would give up its failing military campaign. Japan's resumption of massive attack on Joseon in 1597, known as 정유재란, was not an attempt to subjugate Joseon, but it was an effort to extract by force a rhetoric of a victory in the war from Korea. But again, Japan failed to achieve it. So to wrap up, I'd like to summarize what I have suggested so far. The Korea's local defense, which proved to be quite effective in 1592, fully capitalized on the lingering power of governance and the local knowledge in terms of organizing fighters, securing provisions and weapons, all under the sanction of the court. The Korea's local defense in 1592 reflected how military economies of scale unfolded. As the Japanese troops spread wide and thin and fought at multiple fronts in small groups, they encountered a rising cost in terms of securing food and other supplies, and communicating and coordinating each other, a cost they could hardly manage. It's far beyond they could manage. Problems were more and more complicated, and such complexity chipped away at the effectiveness of the military operation. In a larger context, the military economies of small scale from which Korea's local defense benefited was in rapport with the overall military system of Chosŏn Korea. Joseon's military system was based on three principles. In the late 16th century, military duty was imposed on non-slave adult males, but the Yangban ruling class were exempted from or evaded the military corvée. Soldiers on duty were required to bear all expenses and equipment. During the war, exceptionally, military provisions were occasionally provided, but not always. During the war, even fighters were required to carry their own food by themselves. No separation of peasants and soldiers, which means that soldiers were on duty for a couple of months and off duty for many more months. As a result, Korea did not have many professional soldiers. And so in the system, Korea was not able to operate large-scale military operation. Well, it's impossible. So over time, this military system was reinforced more and more in the direction of further minimizing the burden, whether physical or financial, of the Yangban ruling class. And then you might want to ask, with this almost impossible military system, how did the Chosŏn Dynasty deal with border security or national security or the external security of the dynasty? This one, Chosŏn Korea's security system. Here, Central Army was for the king, not really border security. The king's bodyguards, and they defending the capital. Central Army, that's the function of the Central Army. in the system, only two remaining for border security. So big ticket items were dealt with through diplomacy. In contrast, small items through a tool of military. What do I mean by this? So big ticket items such as security against Ming China or security against Japan was solved through diplomacy, which was far more cost-effective than military solutions. In contrast, small items, security issues involving the Jochians in the north or the Japanese pirates, not Japan, but pirates in the south, were dealt with by a local army, local navy, which was operated on small scale in association with local governors. So this military system basically remained unchanged during the war and then after the war. So in sum, in this context, which I have discussed so far, it was proved in 1592 that Japan had no way of being able to subjugate Joseon, not to mention governing it, even though Hideyoshi mobilized a force of about 130,000 troops. As Hideyoshi's original goals of achieving the Joseon king's Shushi or service by a military campaign shattered due to Korean defense in 1592, the Chosŏn Dynasty was destined to survive. So with this conclusion, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, I learned so much about, well, different perspective of looking at Joseon, I mean, the Imjin War. I think your work is so significant because you are using multiple language sources here. And I think, it really challenges the existing scholarship about Imjin War or the Hideyoshi invasion of Chosŏn Korea. And I think your use of Japanese sources in particular, I think really brings in this new light about, or challenging the existing scholarship about Imjin War. I mean, there are several monographs that's been published, but I think this, what you're really suggesting here, this military operation of Joseon wasn't really talked about in the past. And I mean, there, it just raises so many interesting questions. But I will save my questions a little bit later, and I would like to address our audience's question first. So we have a question from Jonathan Carella. He asked in two parts. So he asked, could you speak to how the war experience changed Korea's view of itself, view of sovereignty, view of its relations with China, and view of the stability of the East Asian order of states? And he also mentioned, he also asked, we know that Korea's national identity was slow in developing. It was not born in 2333 BC Tangun. Was the Imjin War experience the cataclysmic shock that led to an independent Korean national identity, or was Korea moving in an independent direction no matter what over the course of the Chosŏn Dynasty?
Mm-hmm. Okay, the first the question, what Joseon had learned during the war was that for the dynastic security, diplomacy was so important, more than anything else. So that after the war, Chosŏn Korea devoted its whole energy to diplomacy in order to protect its borders in the north and the south. That's why after the war, Joseon chose to form or restore relations with Japan so quickly and then devoting their flattery diplomacy to Ming China even more. So that's the basic. And then what they also have learned is that the interests of the young ruling class was so valuable. It could be saved under any circumstances by utilizing sources that would not burden them. And so that more reinforcing the class structure. So it was a process of really unburdening themselves from all kinds of duties. And so that in a way, very much self-centered. And this type of class structure was further reinforced until it was shaken from the bottom due to other factors and reasons. So that's a short answer. And then the second one is national identity. This is a discourse shared and promoted by the ruling class. For the ordinary people, the social class system was overriding, it's overwhelming. So that some people talk about this issue of national identity, the formation of national consciousness. I think we may need to put this in a wider spectrum, wider context. And so that, but interestingly, what the common people experienced during the war was their contact with Chinese and the Japanese on a daily basis. The Koreans had never had such an experience of contacting Chinese in so big numbers. And then in the beginning, there are several diaries that inform us about that issue, how they felt about people from other countries, Chinese soldiers and Japanese soldiers. And their whole concern was really not really ethnic consciousness, but it's a matter of survival over food. And then what they found is that not only as their competitors, not only the government officials, but also external people as well. And so not much, I don't see any strong evidence of the rise of national consciousness after the war. But it was a favored topic by the ruling class. And then they benefited from this type of discourse over time.
Okay, thank you. We have next question by Jin Sung Kim. He's asking if Hideyoshi sent spies to Korea before the Imjin War in order to investigate the military strategy of Korean troops. It seems that Hideyoshi did not understand the Koreans' notion of subjugation, but it was probably one of the most important elements in terms of the military strategy.
So this is basically this had to do with how Hideyoshi perceived Korea. He didn't send any spies, even though a couple of missions were sent, led by Tsushima daimyo and his associates. But in this time of period, the Chosŏn government had a fine system of watching over the activities of other people. And so that when they came over to Korea, the Korean officials would control their behavior, control their routes, and so on, so that it was almost impossible to acquire detailed or useful information on the Korean military, even though they knew the routes leading to Hansõng from Busan. But that was also quite helpful, but no clear. And then And then this is about intelligence before the war, during the war, after the war. In terms of intelligence or capacities, it's a matter of a degree, but Chosŏn Korea did a good job. And Japan was very poor, and Ming China was very poor, because kind of it's a self-centered perceptions of the other, kind of over confidence. You even can say hubris in this case. And so that their experience was in the domestic environment of Japan. In the case of Hideyoshi, based on his experience, he tried to extend what he had to overseas, and it was a miserable failure. And so, in terms of intelligence gathering, Korea had a means of intelligence gathering toward Ming China, and then also to some extent to Japan. But Hideyoshi failed in this regard.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So we have next question from Ume W. So how was Korea able to mobilize their defense without formal military structure? I think it would be helpful for our audience if you could explain or give this context of military of the Chosun. Because oftentimes when we talk about Imjin War, we only talk about Navy, right? Lee Sun-shin's turtle boat. And I think that's what people are most familiar with. And I think, we don't really know the ground force, like what was going on, right? So, I mean, we do, based on previous studies, we do know that, this the rise of righteous army and, all this the militias and militias rising up, including really all different social status, people from different social statuses. But we don't really know what was really going on at the ground level. So if you could,
Right.
that was, I think, you do mention that the importance of that military operation at a smaller scale,
Right.
especially in 1592. But I think it would be helpful if you could explain that military, especially the ground force Chosun in 1592.
Joseon had a fine system of the military from the beginning, and it was well laid out, so that on paper, it's a really fine system from the center to the periphery, spreading out the whole country. But the problem was the system was not really practiced as it was required by law or by design. And then, but it was like a real fine defined system, but not many soldiers who are ready to fight in the situations of a crisis. And then, as I said, there were three principles in place, only commoners, meaning that, say, about 40–50% of the entire population was required to provide military service. And then half of them would be women, and then half of them would be men, and then certain age group, so that a fraction of population was required to provide military service. And then more seriously, all expenses had to be responsible by the soldiers on duty themselves. So the government would not provide any meaningful financial support, including food and the weapons, except some portion of the Central Army in the capital, the king's bodyguards. There were some professional soldiers. So on paper, it's a fine system spreading out the whole country. And then this system was operated by a force. In other words, by in the system of violence. So it's a miserable, but during this time, during the war, somehow the system began to work from the bottom. They would be mobilized by force to the front. They would run away, and then they would be caught again and they put into defense force and so on. So to that extent, it worked. So it's a small scale operation. It's not a big scale. Because of that system in place on paper, it helped to a great extent in mobilizing defense and fighting against the invaders. Okay. And then I deal with this issue in my book, which I'm writing, because this is a long process and the 3 phases, and I devote 5 chapters to each phase, and each chapter has 6 sub-chapters. So long, it's just 15 chapters, and then the beginning, why it invaded, and Japanese military organization, so on, 2 chapters and 2 conclusion chapters. So it's a big one. So in that process, I try to describe in detail how Chosŏn's military system worked.
Okay, great. So next question is by Taylor Atkins. The dynasty survived, but the economy took decades, if not longer, to recover because of Japan's scorched earth tactics. So did Chosŏn ever prosper again or just survive?
Right. Well, so this is also a tricky issue. As I have mentioned, Japanese troops come to a village and plunder resources and leave. But that's all, and some people would be killed. The land would remain the same, no changes at all. But because many people were killed during the war, after the war, Korea suffered from a shortage of labor in cultivating land, which required intensive labor. So that many lands were abandoned, uncultivated. They required long process of recovery. But it's not really pouring bombs at the place so that the whole area was damaged. That's not the case at all. They just passed through, that's all, killing some people and so on. But taking that as an opportunity of increasing their wealth, the people in power tried to capitalize on what the Japanese had done to the communities. Oh, they destroyed everything, and we cannot do agriculture. We need some tax exemption, or the government we should offer extra labor force to us to restore barren fields and so on. So that by emphasizing the devastated state of economy, the Yangban class tried to increase their interests. They promoted their economic interests. So that this is a very much distorted topic in the history of Chosŏn economy. So what we see instead is that after the war, far more widening disparities between the Yangban ruling class and then the peasants, the commoners. So really, this area has the key to the understanding, refiguring out the Chosŏn's post-war economy. So it's a very good question, but it requires a lot of research, fresh research.
Yeah, I agree. There definitely needs to be more research on this area. But I think the current scholarship, what is showing is that, I mean, right after not right after, but in early 17th century, Korea again went through the Manchu invasions, right? And so after the two wars, so even before recovering, they were invaded again by the Manchus. And so I think that the whole restructuring or reform process really occurred after the two wars. And actually 18th century, according to some scholars, you know, they even mentioned that 18th century is a renaissance of the Chosŏn period, because not only economically, but in many areas, because during King Sånjo and Chongjo was really one of the flourishing period of Chosŏn Dynasty. So we do see some effect that, you know, Chosŏn was prospering in the 18th century, but of course that, you know, situation against turned differently in 19th century with the sudden death of Chongjo in 1800. All right, the next question by Dominic Nozzarella. Would the Chosŏn Dynasty survive without Admiral Lee Sun-shin? Well, this, of course, we cannot talk about Imjin War without Lee Sun-shin. Or would Korea's military be unable to mount a proper defense before they collapse entirely?
Well, that is a hypothetical question, which doesn't have a proper answer in any case. So I don't know, but he happened to be there, and he did what he did, so that it helped a lot. And then Korea's military, as I said, when Japan invaded, that belongs to a big ticket item in terms of securing national safety. And then Chosŏn Korea was not prepared to deal with Ming China or Japan in military terms. There's no such a system. And then it was a system designed to eventually protect those who have land and labor force. And so this has to do with the whole economic system of the country that would more and more benefit those in power. So as a whole, what they figured is that geopolitically, being China is too big. China always too big. It's useless if you try to really deal with that country with a military force. Don't do that. Don't do it. It's a waste of time, waste of resources. Let's do diplomatically. And the same thing, Japan. Japan is too big, too big. Even though the sea, the waters were a good defense, but what bothered the Joseon was a bunch of pirates. Those pirates could be dealt with small-scale military operations, but never Chosŏn Korea expected the entire country of Japan to invade. So it's not in their original design. It's beyond their governing structure. So, but it's the first time. It's the first time, and then the next one came in the late 19th century. So if we compare the case of the Imjin War and then the case in the late 19th century, it would be really wonderful, along with the Manchu. Manchu, Jochins were manageable, but it grew too big and then eventually imposed. And so everything was built into the system of national security within the bounds of manageability. So that's what people do in other countries. That kind of state behavior is seen not only in Chosŏn Korea, but in all other countries as well. So Canada never challenges the United States, you know. We do diplomatically.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So next question by Soon Che.
Mhm,
What is the main reason or motivation that the righteous army or small local army voluntarily joined war? What
mhm,
ideological backgrounds do they have to fight
mhm.
for their country? Personally, I believe that the Confucian ideology that people shared is important.
Well, a simple answer for that is that they come and they kill people. They come and they rob the grain. That's all. That's all. Confucian ideology, values of loyalty, something like that, or a product which people manufactured far later, or when they relate themselves to the court or to the king. And this was done by the leaders uh, in the Yangban class, the Confucian literature and so on. So that all the time, the government, the king and the court would emphasize this kind of ideological the value to the people. But it's really a story that was made far later. You have to really check each small battle one by one. What's there? They had to protect because otherwise they would be killed. And this is a topic that kind of ballooned far later. So we should not be deceived by this kind of ideological discourses. And they have to be really practical. People behave in a rational way based on practical concerns. Not really no food to eat. That you think of Confucian values of loyalty and things like that. It's not. It's not. So it's very interesting. And then so that there are so many issues that should be re-examined regarding the issue of what's so-called righteous armies. And then this issue, the righteous armies, the ideology of righteous armies enormously benefited the Yangban class afterwards.
It's really about urgency and a matter of survival. And you remind me of North Korean defectors. They defect to South Korea or other third countries or even here in the U.S. And it's really more. It was back in the 2000s. It was really more about their survival, not ideology, right? So it's really when it comes to survival. People just face it and fight against it. All right. Next question from Charlotte Calvarella.
Okay.
I like your framing of the Imjin War as a food war, and I am wondering if you plan to include more of an explicit environmental lens to the war to the book. Do you have an idea, for example, if the food issue had an influence on the routes that soldiers took inland? That is,
Right.
did it depend at all on the access they could potentially have to certain food products?
Right. So that issue is really essential to my understanding of the war, because when soldiers were not fed, they cannot do anything. So it was really the most important thing to be done before any fighting. And then there are two issues: how to find grain, food sources, how to secure food sources, and then second issue is how to transport grain to the front, And then in both issues, so many interesting dramas, so many interesting issues involved. So this is very important. And then a long story short, transporting grain to a remote front was a challenge. And then the Japanese troops could bring their food by ship to Busan, and from there wasn't able to transport them to their camps. So that after Busan, what they tried to find was to plunder villages. The same thing. And in China, they could bring food to Uiju or to Pyongyang, at best to Ganghwa. But from there to the front was remote in Ulsan and Suncheon and so on. And that was what the Korean people had to. Why the Japanese and Chinese couldn't do? Because no way to do that. The road, and we were talking about the routes, the highways and stuff like that, but there was no such a thing. It's all trail. It's like a trail, a meandering trail. The only way to carry them would be on your backs. They carry loads on your backs, and then they have to eat. So if a person carry some load on their back, on his back from Busan to Seoul, when he arrives in Seoul, nothing would be remaining, because he had to survive along the way by eating what he's carrying. Okay, so it was almost impossible. So what happened is that many Korean peasants were killed. People were killed. So as a whole, this is a matter of demand and supply. Supply by producing, and the producers were killed, and then they uprooted, so that the supply on the constant decrease, and then more mouth from Japanese soldiers, Chinese soldiers. The demand on the rise, the huge gap, the difference between supply and demand was starvation. Somebody had to die because of no food. So that overall, from the beginning to the end, it was really a fierce war over food for survival, and it's invisible in many cases. And now there are not many documents detailing how intense, how very scary this war was for many people. So this is an excellent topic. And then in terms of environment, this had to do with the infrastructure of Chosŏn Korea. And the infrastructure was so poor, so it prevented the Japanese from transporting their food to their fronts. That was a fatal factor that crushed over time their war goals. So and then I have given a couple of talks on these food issues, and then it's really interesting, and then it hasn't been much discussed regarding the Imjin War, but that's an excellent question.
Our next question. So this war was used by James H. This war was used by the Japanese to justify future invasions. Did this war change how Koreans view themselves? Does it play into any current Korean nationalism?
Well, yes. In the late 19th century, and then colonial period, once there was a special exhibition in Seoul of textbooks used during the colonial period in Korea. History books, society, what they call sahe, and then the ethics and so on, from grade 1 to grade 12. It's a whole collection. And then what is interesting is that in every single textbook which the Japanese made to educate Koreans, two things are always there. One is Empress Jinggu Kogo's conquest of the three kingdoms ancient three kingdoms in Korea, 신라, Baekje, and Goguryeo. And then the second thing is Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He had an ambition to conquer not only Chosŏn Korea but also Manchuria and China, so that they inculcate their kind of stories to Korean kids all the time. So it's a kind of the tool for justifying what they were doing at the time by bringing up the stories that could be cooked from the past. So that's a really, it's also about that issue is also a good topic for any, say, PhD dissertation. It's wonderful. It's every textbook has. It's very amazing. It's amazing. And then primary sources, Navy and so on. So because I have been dealing with this issue for a long time, and then reading. So recently I traveled to China more often than to other countries. The Chinese materials, Korean materials, and Japanese materials altogether, it's huge. And we know most of these primary sources for Chinese materials and primary materials. So far, about 360 items have been identified. So we are talking about the Ming Lu as one item. Ming Lu is huge, and Ming is huge, just one item, but far more than 350 more materials. Japan, it goes on to over 500. And then Korea too. Korea, I'm using many diaries, and then regarding just confining to diaries, so far about 50 diaries have been identified, located. So that there's no end, and it's really challenging to compare. And but what is more challenging is to cross-check, cross-referencing, because so many exaggerations, lies, and so on. You have to really find one data here, and then you have to check against found in other sources. That takes a long time. So that we can have really sort of a balanced, contextualized understanding of the war. So you have to really go over the boundaries between different countries, and then also applying theories that have been refined and applied in other parts of the world, including North America and Europe and so on, because human beings have been fighting all the time each other. They never stop. So that there's so many, it's about human behavior and at the same time state behavior, which are universal. And so it's a really fascinating topic to do.
So I think for the due to interest of time, I think I'll collect the final questions, and then including mine, and then ask Professor He to answer. Well, so I think you addressed parts of Xiaoyi's question, but I think but the question is also asking why. So the question was related to sources, but why do you think local Korean why previous studies have neglected to examine local Korean army? Well, they have extensively examined Navy's role, but like, you know, in your work, not many studies have actually, you know, analyzed the local or ground force that you discuss today in your presentation. So maybe if you could explain, you know, why you think previous studies have not really looked into this role of military operation. And also we have Ayoung Che's question. Could you please comment on the role of women during this era in Chosun as fighters, soldiers, as well in the context of becoming victims of sexual abuse or violence? And my final question is, so, you know, you talk about this military operation, and I think, you know, you don't really emphasize China's role here as previous studies have done. You know, like, you know, we, you know, the common perception is that Japan went up to Pyongyang, northern part of the the Korean Peninsula. China intervened, and then you know, they really shifted the war in the environment of the war. And so I think you're kind of challenging that, and we really have to look at 1592, even I mean, very carefully to examine what was really going on. So if you could, you know, how can this really, is this, you know, enough answer? So this military capability of small scale at Chosun in 1592, was it enough to really, you know, say that, you know, Chosun was capable of well, not winning the war, but at least, you know, dealing with the war up to, because based on your presentation, it sounded like it sounded as if after 1592, from 1593 up to, you know, onwards, it was really about waiting for Hideyoshi to give up. They had already failed. But then how would you explain this China's military intervention in this context?
Right. Yeah, first of all, so far, I think the Xiao just question is also similar to that. Previously, studies of righteous armies have involved local leaders who sacrifice themselves, mobilize their slave, and providing their grain and food and so on. So that all in a spirit of loyalty, the Confucian values and so on. So that is what has been heavily added far later. So that what you need to do is to examine, even though it's small, one battle by one battle, what happened there in what context. Now for that, now we have sources that allow us to do that, diaries and so on, and the letters, kanchar. So it's a kind of exciting moment to revise our conventional understanding. So it's doable. It's doable. And then in terms of the role of the military, I do not say that what the Korean self-defense fighters did in 1592 determined the overall course of the war, but it helped to crush Hideyoshi's original war goals. And then after that, the war lasted 6 more years. During the time, many things happened, so that the overall contours of the war were shaped by not just one factor, but the many factors, and some major factors that involving food issues, diplomacy and governance, and so on. So that in particular, the issue of diplomacy is fascinating, because that reveals the inner self of each country, bring their inner structure to the fore, so that we can shed some light on them. So it's a long process and then complicated, so each item, each issue, based on empirical study and based on evidence, it could go on. And then the Ming military had about 10 battles, 10 battles. And then in phase one, 3 battles, that's all. And all in 1597, 98, 7 battles, in between a couple of minor battles. So when you examine each of them, you can have some clear answers, clear pictures, and then yes and no. It's not really all yes or all no, yes and no. And then those 2 elements were combined to bring the situation in a different direction, so that it's accumulated over time. And then the women, this is very good issue. And then I wrote one article in Korean. This issue has not been studied extensively because we do not find their voices, or indirect voices by their husbands, their fathers, brothers, and so on. So that's one challenge. But still, by stitching all those pieces of information together, we can have some. And at the same time, during the war, the women were victimized in many different ways and tremendously. But interestingly, that aspect has not been really well excavated. This is an excellent topic. Why in Japanese behavior, and also to some extent the Chinese behavior, and then attitudes the Korean officials and the king showed to them all the time. Just shocking. But afterwards, after the war, what we see is the reinforcement of the Confucian values of chastity and things like that. But at the same time, there is another trend of new development in which women try to free themselves from the bounds of society and ethical values. And that could be found in some works done by literature scholars in Korea who have examined kasa, novels, and so on. So that when we listen to what the 상강행실도 people are saying, that's quite different from what real life stories tell us. So it should be balanced. So that one particular scholar, which whom I found very inspiring, is Hwang Jae-gyun. He's a senior scholar. I don't know. I have met, but in the 1980s, somewhere. Excellent article. Totally different from what the 상강행실도 type will be saying. And so certainly there are voices, different trends, but they didn't tell their stories directly to us. That's why it's challenging. So I think that issue is really important, and then I really encourage somebody to do that.
Thank you so much. I think I totally agree with you that we really need to look at the difference or the gap between didactic texts or norms versus practice. That's always very important for historians to examine. All right, with that, I think we would have to end. We're a little bit over our time. I'm sure our audience will be joining me thanking Professor He for his excellent, fascinating, and very important work. I hope we'll be able to read your book soon. And
That's gonna take some time.
well, in the near future.
Yeah.
And then please join me in thanking Professor He. And I would also like to thank our audience for your excellent questions. Thank you so much. They were all very excellent and engaging questions. With that, I think we'll end our Soh Jaipil lecture today. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.